I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Numbers, introducing it in this short section. If we go back to Genesis sets forth Israel's relationship with the covenant God as creator, as sustainer, both as creator, but also as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where God introduces himself to Abraham and then gives promises to Abraham and to his son and to his grandchildren and to the entire family. We get to the book of Exodus, and that's how God redeemed his covenant people, bringing them out of Egypt in the Exodus, but then bringing them to Mount Sinai and giving them the law and the tabernacle. Leviticus then picks up at the tabernacle, giving instructions on how God's people are to worship him, and then Numbers takes up where the historical narrative back in Exodus left off, but we went through the law in Leviticus. Numbers starts off, then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting on the first of the second month in the second year after they'd come out of the land of Egypt. We're still at the tabernacle, we're still at Mount Sinai, and God still has some other things for Israel to do as our story picks up. The name of the book, the Hebrew name is Bamidbar, in the wilderness, taken from that first verse that we just read. The Greek name arithmoi corresponds to our English word numbers, and it's all about the fact that you have a numbering of the people in the beginning of the book. At the end of the book, you're going to have another numbering of the people, but in the middle, there's a lot of other things that all take place in the wilderness. So I really sort of prefer the Hebrew name, that which takes place in the wilderness. Exodus then ends with the construction of the tabernacle. Leviticus tells of the worship that takes place in the tabernacle. And now Numbers takes up the story of what took place in the wilderness. They're still at the tabernacle as the story opens, but the tabernacle is eventually going to be moving, as will the people of God be moving, to get ready to go into the promised land. And yet there's going to be a very long detour that takes place. Now, why should we study the book of Numbers? It's sort of almost like asking, why should we take algebra or something like that? There are historical reasons. It tells us how the Israelites came from Sinai to the Promised Land and why it did take so long. It normally ought to take about a few weeks. 4 to 6 weeks maybe for them to go through the Sinai, get the law, and then go up and go into the Promised Land. And instead, it's going to take them 40 years. The theological reason is this tells me the high price of unbelief. You see, they're not going to go into the land when they should have gone into the land because of Israel's unbelief and rebellion against God. And as a result, the entire generation is going to die in the wilderness. And that reminds us religiously that God is a God of order, of number, but he's also a God who takes his promises seriously and with whom we cannot trifle. And so we must listen to the Word of God. What's the big idea in the book of Numbers? As we said, it's in the wilderness, but it's going to be failure in the wilderness. The big idea is that Israel is going to fail, and they're going to die in the wilderness. But it also teaches us some things about being in our own wilderness. How we face, yes, failure, but also how we can believe and find faith in the midst of difficulty, in the midst of difficult times in the wilderness. The book of Leviticus then talks about the believer's worship, but the book of Numbers talks about the believer's work. In Leviticus we read about purity. Now in Numbers we read about pilgrimage, the journey. The book of Leviticus speaks to our spiritual position. The book of Numbers speaks to our spiritual progress. In Leviticus we saw ceremony in the sanctuary. Now in the book of Numbers we're going to see the history in the wilderness. Here's our outline then, and I'm borrowing this from Irving Johnson. He was the fellow who started me off on using charts and maps and things like that. In chapters 1 through the middle of chapter 10 we're going to see Mount Sinai, and then we're going to move from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. This is an area just south of the Promised Land, and the spies are going to be sent in, and there will be an attempt to go into the land, but the people will fail. And we'll see that failure on several levels. And so from that point on, we're going to see them wandering the wilderness from chapter 15 through chapter 21. At the end of chapter 21, 40 years will have passed, and they're ready to go into the promised land, and they'll find themselves on the plain of Moab. We'll look at a map and see where that takes place. But we'll be in the plains of Moab, ready to go into the land. The chapters 1 through 21 are all taking place in the wilderness with that old generation. When I get to chapter 22, it's a new generation that's ready to go into the land, but they're not there yet. There's some things that still have to be done. Time-wise, the first 10 chapters cover the space of several weeks. A year has passed since the Exodus has taken place. They've been at Mount Sinai. There's a few weeks, preparations for the journey to the promised land, but then they get to Kadesh and they fail, and we're going to see a space of 38 years that pass before they're ready to go now to the plains of Moab, and then we'll have several months as they prepare to come into the land. The movement is from Mount Sinai to Mount Hor. That's the place where Aaron is going to die, to Mount Nebo, and that's the place where Moses is going to die before, because he doesn't get to go into the land, and we'll see why in the book of Numbers.